You wouldn't normally put a warlord, a painter, and a political theorist in the same room unless you were trying to change the course of history. Course, literally. In the summer of 1503, Cesare Borgia, Leonardo da Vinci, and Niccolò Machiavelli found themselves tangled in the same ambitious, bizarre plan to reroute an entire river, not for beauty, not even for glory, for power. This wasn't some Renaissance dream team brought together by fate. It was strategy, desperation, and just a touch of delusion. What followed was part science experiment, part military campaign, and part slow-motion disaster. It involved canals, betrayal, flooding, a bull's intestines, and the world's most famous smile. Welcome to Capers and Cocktails, a true crime podcast that doesn't take itself too seriously and gives you something to enjoy while you listen. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you're enjoying one of our themed cocktails, ensure you're of legal drinking age and have fun, but drink responsibly. Cesare Borgia was born in 1475, the son of Pope Alexander V and his mistress, I'm going to try here, Venosa dei Cantanei, or something like that. As a member of the infamous Borgia family, Cesare's life was steeped in political intrigue and ambition. Initially pursuing a career in the church, he quickly abandoned the priesthood to follow his true calling, which was military and political power. This is a common theme here, power. He became a skilled commander, serving as a general for his father's papal army. Yes, the Pope had an army. I think he still does. Anyway, known for his ruthlessness and strategic alliances, Cesare was instrumental in the complex and often dangerous political landscape of the Italian Renaissance. Into his court came two other figures who would remain known for centuries later, but not for the reasons we're going to be talking about in today's podcast. Before Leonardo da Vinci, yes, that Leonardo da Vinci, entered the court of Cesare Borgia, he had already established himself as one of the most brilliant minds of the Renaissance. Born in 1452 in Vinci, Italy, Leonardo had a bit in common with Cesare, as he was the illegitimate son of a wealthy notary and a peasant woman. He received a diverse education in the arts, sciences, and engineering, which laid the foundation for his legendary work. By the time he was in his 20s, Leonardo was working in Florence as an art apprentice. However, Leonardo's genius extended beyond the canvas. Some of you probably know this. He dabbled in engineering, anatomy, and various scientific endeavors, producing notebooks filled with sketches, diagrams, and ideas. He was the original Renaissance man. Also important to note, well, probably not, is that Leonardo was pretty well known to be hot. He was a good-looking dude. His growing fame eventually led him to Milan, where he worked for a Duke Ludovico Sforza as a military engineer and court artist, before eventually joining Cesare Borgia's court around 1502. Before Niccolò Machiavelli, yes, that Machiavelli, became famous for his political writings, he was deeply embedded in the political and military affairs of Renaissance Italy. Okay, before we start, I normally use people's first names in my podcast, in case you haven't noticed, but I have to call Machiavelli Machiavelli, you know? You get it, cocktail conspirators, you get it. Born in 1469 in Florence, Machiavelli was the son of a lawyer and grew up in a city-state that was a hotbed of political intrigue and power struggles. There are some weird stories about him also being an illegitimate child because apparently people in the 1500s were just obsessed with people's love lives. Ugh, I roll. Some things, I guess, haven't really changed. Anyway, that was likely just made up by his enemies. Machiavelli was well-educated, starting private schooling when he was 7. He was trained primarily in poetry, literature, and history, rather than theology, philosophy, or law. In 1494, when Machiavelli was in his mid-20s, he joined the Florentine government as a diplomat and secretary to the Second Chancery. He was the guy you called when things got messy. He would negotiate with big players like the Pope and France, all while dealing with military chaos. In a time when ruling families were rising and falling left and right, he built a reputation for being sharp, strategic, and always a step ahead in the political game. So, what happens when Cesare, Leonardo, and Machiavelli walk into a bar? They drink, of course. Anyway, we're going to sip on a Bellini as we learn about the hijinks of the original Italian job. All right, cocktail conspirators, let me take you to Venice, somewhere between 1934 and 1948, when a bartender named Giuseppe Cipriani, the genius behind Harry's Bar, created the Bellini. Why the name, you ask? Well, it's all about that beautiful blush pink hue that reminded him of a painting by 15th century Venetian artist Giovanni Bellini. So, the next time you blend one up, just know you're drinking a piece of art history. Remember, head to the description box for the cocktail and mocktail recipe and sip up like the Italian masters would have had this drink actually been invented then. Oh, and blenders. Before you drink too many of these, be sure to hit the like button wherever you're listening to this podcast or watching it. Just the like button makes a huge difference. Thank you so much, cocktail conspirators. Okay, imagine it. Italy in the early 1500s, a collection of city-states, each locked in a high-stakes race to outshine the others in power and culture. Milan was under the rule of the Sforza family, Florence under the Medici, and both were competing fiercely to be the ultimate center of Renaissance influence. They pulled in the greatest artists and enlisted the finest engineers, generals, and architects to transform their cities into living masterpieces. Okay. Zoom in with me on Florence. Located in the heart of Italy, it wasn't coastal, but it was undeniably powerful. The Medici family's banking empire made it one of the wealthiest city-states in all of Italy, giving them immense influence far beyond their borders. Their main rival was Pisa, and the two cities were locked in a constant rivalry along the river Arno, both eager to outdo the other. Florence, a powerful commercial hub tucked inland, had always eyed the Arno River as its gateway to the sea. Meanwhile, Pisa, proud and fiercely independent, was not about to roll over. The animosity ran deep. Florentines openly despised the Pisans, and the feeling was very much mutual. After years of clashes, Florence finally took control of Pisa in 1406, but their grip was always a bit shaky, with rival powers like Venice and Milan eager to snatch Pisa away, or at the very least, keep Florence from dominating the route to the Mediterranean. Then came 1494. Ludovico Sforza of Milan invited Charles VIII of France to invade Italy, aiming to press his claim to the Kingdom of Naples. At first, Florence tried to resist under Piero de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent's less capable and magnificent son, but the French stormed through, and in the process, Pisa slipped from Florence's hands, once again reclaiming its independence, at least for a while. As Florence sought to expand its power and standing, they called in Machiavelli, Italy's strategic mastermind. Serving in the Florentine court, Machiavelli wasn't just a diplomat, but also the architect of many of Florence's political maneuvers. Machiavelli traveled to the court of the Borgias. Yes, that's Cesare Borgia. Get it? Anyway, it was during this visit that Machiavelli crossed paths with none other than Leonardo da Vinci, who was residing in the Borgia court at that time. Leonardo had just finished designing siege engines for the Sforza family in Milan and was now living among the Borgias. He just was all over the place. When Leonardo first made his way into the courts of Italy's elite families, he wasn't the master artist we know him as today. Instead, he entered as an engineer and an innovator. Think of him as a Renaissance-era jack-of-all-trades, the Renaissance man, with a knack for designing bridges, weapons, and complex machines of war. He didn't boast about his painting abilities. In fact, he would pretty much always downplay them, claiming that he could paint and draw as well as any other. Okay, better than me. When Leonardo and Machiavelli crossed paths, it wasn't just a meeting of great minds. It was the collision of art and strategy, politics and invention. Over what was likely a few glasses of wine, or in my imagination, a Bellini, they came up with a plan that could elevate Florence's wealth and cripple their rival Pisa, all without a single sword being drawn. By the summer of 1503, documentary evidence shows Leonardo and Machiavelli were working together on highly important military projects in the war against Pisa, and their big, ingenious idea? To steal the River Arno. Well, not quite to steal it, but reroute it. The Arno is more than just a scenic backdrop. It's the lifeblood of Tuscany, fueling its agriculture and cementing Florence's role as the region's economic and political powerhouse. And these guys, they were going to reroute it. Machiavelli's assistant would say, quote, "Besides depriving the Pisans of their source of life, those who were undertaking this project were to benefit our town immensely," end quote. The plan was nothing short of revolutionary. Redirecting the Arno River would allow Florence to irrigate its fields more efficiently, sell excess water, and Leonardo proposed creating a series of canals that would allow ships to sail directly from the Mediterranean to Florence, bypassing the traditional coastal routes. Leonardo had been thinking about the Arno River for a long time. He was born in the valley around the river, and his earliest dated drawing is a sketch of the Arno Valley. A decade before this secret meeting over a Bellini, Leonardo had developed a plan to make the Arno River navigable, turning Florence into a seaport and irrigating his birthplace. The plan involved tunneling through mountains, displacing millions of tons of earth, and digging an intricate system of canals. He envisioned a workforce of tens of thousands laboring for years to bring this bold vision to life. Should manpower be a problem, Leonardo wrote, "Numerous machines could be used to facilitate the work," as you can see in his sketch of a literal mechanized canal digging system. I mean, this guy, he really wanted to do this project. Once they had their blueprints, Machiavelli returned to Florence to take the first steps toward making their dream a reality. Leonardo's notebooks show the plan sketched out in extreme detail. The canal was supposed to be a mile long, 30 feet deep, and 80 feet wide at its mouth. The city of Florence hired an engineer named Colombino to oversee the operation, but the work took far longer than anyone had expected. The real headache, though, came from Pisa, Florence's rival, who launched repeated attacks on the work crews, making progress even slower. Under pressure to finish ahead of schedule, or I guess even just on schedule, Colombino made a fateful decision. He altered Leonardo's original plans. Leonardo had designed a massive single trench to divert the water in one swift strategic move. But Colombino decided to dig two smaller, shallower trenches, assuming the river would naturally erode them into a larger channel over time. That did not work. Colombino also misjudged how many workers the project would need. With 2,000 laborers on site, his estimate of 30 to 40,000 worker days suggested the project could be finished in just 2 to 3 weeks, a timeline far more optimistic than Leonardo's, maybe too optimistic, I guess. Leonardo had carefully accounted for the massive effort required to move that much dirt. However, because no one even attempted to construct the digging machines that he designed, progress was way slower than expected. On October 3rd, Machiavelli wrote again to the Ten of War, proposing that the situation could be fixed with 7 or 8 days of focused work. But before anything could be done, a violent storm hit, wrecking several guard boats at the Arno's mouth, killing 80 people and causing the ditch walls to collapse. The Pisans quickly took advantage, tearing down the low dam on the Arno and filling in the ditches. With the canal project in ruins, the Florentines gave up further efforts. Hoping to salvage something from the failed investment, the Signora offered pardons to Pisans who would defect. But instead, the Pisans used the offer to send out surplus extra people, I guess, that weren't important, and ease their food crisis. By October 12th, the government left the decision to continue the siege to the Florentine commander, who soon just called off operations. The army disbanded, the canals were filled, and the ambitious plan by Leonardo and Machiavelli was abandoned. Machiavelli's assistant would write, quote, "This undertaking came to cost 7,000 ducats, or more, because in addition to the salary for the workers and other things, it was necessary to keep 1,000 soldiers in that place to protect the workers from the attacks of the Pisans," end quote. In 1503, 7,000 ducats was no small sum. It's about $1.8 million in gold today. But in terms of spending power, it was easily closer to a few million modern dollars. That would be enough to fund an entire military campaign or a massive engineering project. Turns out it went to both and failed at both. The war dragged on for another 5 years. When the world's smartest engineer tells you how to do something, maybe, just maybe, you should listen. Machiavelli and Leonardo collaborated on several other failed projects between 1503 and 1506, including at least one painting. But that painting was a disaster. Oh, Machiavelli, he didn't paint it, but he hooked him up with the person. Anyway, Leonardo's preliminary sketch for the Battle of Anghiari left everyone in awe, but his decision to experiment with a new painting technique turned into a disaster. Paint dripped, the work was abandoned, and the unfinished fresco was eventually destroyed. At the time, this failure had real consequences for both Leonardo and Machiavelli, putting their reputations, status, and their bank accounts at risk. Maybe that's why neither of them wrote about it. Oh, they didn't write about the Arno River either. Who wants to remind the world of their high-profile flops? Cesare Borgia's downfall came after the death of his father, Pope Alexander VI, in 1503. Without the protection and influence of his papa, get it? Anyway, he struggled to maintain control over the territories he had gained in central Italy. His main ally, Pope Julius II, turned against him, and the entire political landscape shifted. Caesar's military campaigns faltered, and he was eventually captured by the forces of the King of Spain in 1504. Though he was released, he was forced into obscurity, living out the remainder of his life basically, he was isolated. In 1512, after the Medici family regained control of Florence, Machiavelli lost his position and was even briefly imprisoned. It was during this period of political exile that Machiavelli wrote his most famous work, The Prince, which offered a pragmatic, sometimes ruthless guide to political leadership. His time as a diplomat and civil servant shaped his views on power, politics, and human nature, influencing his later writings. When he was later released, he would write about his group of buds who would meet to fool around, eat, and discuss sex or politics. He sounds just like us. Isn't that nice? In his final years, Machiavelli lived in obscurity, working on historical and political writings, but never fully regaining political influence. He died in 1527 at the age of 58. After leaving Cesare Borgia's court in 1503, Leonardo returned to Florence, where he worked on various commissions, one of which, a large mural on one wall of the Great Council Hall of the Palazzo Vecchio, he secured thanks to his buddy Machiavelli. I read a book about all of this, and I fell into more rabbit holes than I normally do. But one thing I did learn is that sketches for these big murals were called cartoons. A cartoon in Renaissance art is the full-scale prep drawing, or basically the sketch for a painting or a mural or a tapestry. Artists like Leonardo would create a detailed cartoon on paper or parchment, sometimes even using charcoal or chalk to plan out the entire composition before transferring it to the wall or canvas. So take that, Looney Tunes. I don't even know what that means. I don't even know what I mean. Leonardo also was evidently a prankster. He once rigged up a bizarre setup using a bull's intestines. He cleaned them out, connected them to hidden bellows in the next room, and waited. When a group of people entered that large hall, Leonardo, or maybe his assistant, started pumping air through the tubes, the intestines began to swell and expand, turning into these ghostly air-filled shapes that slowly filled the room, pushing the startled guests into the corners. It was weird. It was gross. I really don't think it was that funny, but maybe he did. I don't know. I couldn't tell you. In 1516, Leonardo moved to France at the invitation of King Francis I, where he spent his final years in the countryside near Amboise. Although he did less art, Leonardo continued his studies in anatomy, engineering, and other fields. He died in 1519, leaving behind a legacy of unfinished works and notebooks that would later influence both art and science. And fun fact, the Arno River itself ended up as the backdrop for one of Leonardo's most famous works, the Mona Lisa. So in a roundabout way, the river found its way into history after all. And as for Florence and Pisa, they eventually made peace without any rivers being redirected. Thanks for hanging out with me. Who knew that Leonardo da Vinci would be the type to try and pull off the original Italian job? Machiavelli, sure, but Leo? I hope that you enjoyed both the Bellini and the brouhaha today. If you want to look even deeper, head to the description box for my sources, including Fortune is a River, a book from the late 90s that you can find online to read for free. Next week, another tale about a crime that easily could have happened in Florida, if you know what I mean. I'll see you next week, and remember, there are always alternatives to trying to change the actual course of Mother Nature.